It was meant to be a quiet goodbye. Harold Jameson, a 79-year-old war veteran, came to St. Mary's Church to bury his wife, the woman he had loved for over 50 years. He wore his old army jacket, walked slow with cane, and carried her urn in both hands. There was no crowd, no music, just silence and sorrow. But that cold morning turned into something no one expected. As Harold stepped out his truck, a young police officer confronted him about parking too close to the entrance. Harold tried to explain, but the officer grew impatient. Within seconds, the officer grabbed the old man and slammed him to the ground, right there in front of the church and his wife's funeral. What followed, just 6 minutes later, would silence the town. Veterans from every branch began arriving, parking their bikes, standing shoulder to shoulder around their fallen brother. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They stood in silence, tall, proud, unshaken. What happened that day wasn't just about Harold. It was a reminder. When one of our own is disrespected, we show up. Always. Because Brotherhood doesn't end when the war is over. It lives on. Harold Jameson was 79 years old. He walked slowly with cane and wore a faded army jacket that had long molded to his frame. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't for show. That jacket held pieces of his life that only he understood. On that cold morning, he didn't come to impress anyone. He came to bury the woman who had been his anchor through war, peace, and everything in between. Her name was Margaret. They had met in 1969, just before Harold shipped off to Vietnam. She was quiet, warm, and kind, the kind of woman who waited without complaint and prayed every night that the man she loved would come home alive. He did, but not whole. The war had left scars on his body and shadows in his mind. Nightmares came often. Words came slow. But Margaret stayed. She stayed through the silence, the restless nights, the bad days when Harold barely recognized himself in the mirror. She never left his side. For over 50 years, Margaret had been more than a wife. She had been his compass. She kept him steady when the past tried to pull him under. And now she was gone. That morning at St. Mary's Church, Harold moved with the stiffness of old wounds and grief. In his arms, he held the wooden box that carried Margaret's ashes. It was light in weight, but heavy in every other way. Each step he took toward the church doors felt longer than a mile. Inside, the room was still. There were no choirs, no crowds, just a handful of old friends, a pastor, and a flag-draped table waiting at the front. Harold placed the urn gently down, then stood at the edge of the casket. On top of it, folded with military precision, was a flag, red, white, and blue, full of meaning. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white. That flag had draped his own brothers in arms, men he watched fall in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Now it covered Margaret, the last person who ever truly knew all of him. He didn't cry, not out loud, but behind those tired eyes, every memory was flooding back. The day he left for basic training, the letters she wrote, the way she looked waiting for him at the bus station in 1971. Her hands, her voice, the way she said his name like it was a promise. Harold stood in silence, letting the weight of 50 years press down on him all at once. He was a soldier, yes, but more than that, he was a husband saying goodbye. He didn't want speeches. He didn't want comfort. All he wanted was to hold that flag a little longer, like it was the last piece of Margaret he had left. People watched from the pews, quiet and respectful. They didn't move. They didn't interrupt. In that moment, Harold's grief was a sacred thing, something too deep for words, too raw for anyone to touch. That jacket he wore, tore at the cuffs, frayed at the collar, had seen combat, funerals, births, and long nights spent by Margaret's hospital bed. It carried the smell of old leather and time, but also carried stories of sacrifice, love, and endurance. As the pastor began the short reading, Harold didn't sit. He kept his hand on the flag, head slightly bowed. The words echoed faintly in the high ceiling, but Harold wasn't really hearing them. He was somewhere else, back on the porch of their first home, back in a hospital room when Margaret held his hand and told him, "It's okay, you can let go." But he hadn't let go. Not yet, maybe not ever. Outside, the wind picked up. A group of older men stood near the entrance, some in leather jackets, others with pins and patches from wars past. They had come for Harold, not because he asked, he never would, but because that's what brothers do. Inside, the ceremony moved on, but Harold didn't move. His cane rested beside the table. His hand stayed firm on the flag. No one rushed him. No one dared. For those few minutes, time itself seemed to stop, honoring not just Margaret's life, but the quiet, weathered man who had loved her through a lifetime of war and peace. And as a final prayer was spoken, Harold whispered something under his breath, a goodbye only Margaret would understand. The room remained still, held in the silence of true love and old pain. And in that silence, Harold Jameson stood tall, not as a soldier, not even as a husband, but as a man who had given everything and loved even more. Across the street from St. Mary's Church, Officer Derek Mason was assigned to manage traffic. He was young, new to the force, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that often comes before wisdom. That morning, he noticed an old pickup parked just beyond the marked curb. To him, it looked like a violation. The back bumper edged past a faded no parking sign. He didn't recognize the veteran plates. He didn't see the folded flag on the dashboard. All he saw was a truck in the wrong spot. Harold Jameson had stepped out of the church moments earlier. He needed air. The service had barely started, and the weight in his chest had grown too heavy. He leaned on his cane, standing beside the truck that carried Margaret's urn in the back. His mind was elsewhere, in memories, in grief, in the ache of goodbye. Officer Mason approached quickly. His voice was sharp. "You can't park here. Move it." Harold turned, startled. His hearing wasn't clear, and the officer's tone caught him off guard. "I'm here for my wife's service," he said quietly, gesturing toward the church. "I don't care," Mason replied. "You're blocking access. Move it or it gets towed." The words came cold, rushed. Witnesses would later say the officer never asked why Harold was there, never asked if he needed help, never looked closely at the man's age, his jacket, or the way he struggled just to stay standing. Harold tried again. "Please. Her ashes are in the truck. It's her funeral." But the officer stepped closer. His hand reached out, and in one motion, too fast, too forceful, he grabbed Harold's arm. The cane slipped. Harold stumbled. His knees gave out. Then came the fall. A sound of bone and pavement. A gasp from the small crowd outside the church. Margaret's urn shook slightly in the back of the truck. The folded flag shifted on the front seat. Harold lay still, face against the cold ground. A trickle of blood from his brow. His glasses cracked beside him. Silence hung heavy. The officer stepped back, hand on his belt. "I gave you a lawful order," he said, louder now, as if volume could justify the moment. An usher from the church rushed forward. Two older men helped Harold sit up. His hands trembled. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. One sleeve scraped, a thread of fabric dangling near the patch that read U.S. Army. Harold looked dazed, humiliated. "I was just trying to bury my wife," he whispered. No one said a word. People on the church steps stood frozen. Some held back tears. One woman pulled out her phone, recording without a word. Another gently placed Harold's cane beside him. The wood was cracked. And then a voice rang out from the street. Low, measured. "That man served this country before that kid was even born." Another added, "You don't put your hands on someone who wore the uniform. Not like that. Not ever." The officer didn't answer. He looked around, unsure, uncomfortable. But the damage was already done. The church bells hadn't even finished their first chime, and already the day had shifted. What was meant to be sacred had been stained by arrogance, disrespect, a complete lack of understanding. Harold sat quietly as someone wiped the blood from his brow. The pastor came out, kneeled beside him, and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Harold. We're here." But Harold didn't speak. He stared straight ahead, toward the open church doors. Inside, the front pew sat empty. Margaret's urn waited on the altar. The man who had fought battles thousands of miles from home now fought a different one, in the place where he should have been allowed peace. And as the crowd gathered closer, silent and tense, no one yet knew that just 6 minutes later, the street would change again. that the sound of motorcycles would echo down the lane, that a brotherhood bound not by blood, but by service, was already on its way. But for now, all they saw was a broken cane, a shaken veteran, and the silence a moment no one would forget. No sirens, no apologies, just cold concrete, a cracked voice, and the memory of a man who came to say goodbye, and was thrown down instead. It didn't take long. 6 minutes, to be exact. The church was still in silence when the low sound of engines began rolling down the street. First, it was 2 Harley-Davidsons, then 5, then a full dozen. The rumble echoed off the brick walls of nearby buildings, deep and steady, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. These weren't weekend bikers out for a ride. They came in rows, clean and tight. Some wore black leather vests patched with insignias. U.S. Marines, Army Airborne, Navy SEALs. Others wore denim faded from age, with silent symbols stitched into the fabric. Names of fallen brothers, years served in distant wars. They didn't come to make noise. They came because a single message had been sent, a brief, panicked text from Harold's grandson, who had watched his grandfather slam the pavement. No explanation, no details, just enough words to stir something deep in every man who read it. Grandpa got hurt. At the funeral. Cop threw him down. Please come. They didn't ask questions. They came. As the motorcycles came to stop, engines were cut in unison. One by one, the riders dismounted. They didn't speak, didn't yell. There were no chants, no signs, no threats. Only presence. A silent wall of service. The officer who had thrown Harold to ground stood near his patrol car, uncertain now. He shifted his weight, avoided eye contact, looked, suddenly very young. The veterans walked slowly, but with purpose, toward the church steps. Their boots hit the ground with quiet rhythm. They formed a half-circle around Harold, who still sat on the pavement, his hands trembling slightly as the pain in his shoulder grew. One of them, a Marine with salt and pepper hair and a faded eagle tattoo, bent down beside Harold. "Let's get you up, sir." He extended a hand, not rushed, not forceful, just steady. Harold looked up, eyes brimming but not broken. He nodded. 2 more men joined, each gripping an elbow gently. They lifted him to his feet with the kind of care reserved for brothers, not strangers. One of them dusted off Harold's jacket, brushing away the dirt and blood from the fall. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a restoration of dignity, of respect, of something the morning had tried to take. A Navy vet reached down and picked up Harold's broken cane. He examined it for a moment, then held it like it was a fallen flag. Another pulled a new cane from his saddlebag, a polished oak cane with a brass eagle handle, and handed it to Harold without a word. Harold accepted it slowly. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Every man standing there understood. They had seen enough, lived enough, lost enough, and now they stood beside him. The officer took a few steps backward, unsure of his place. He started to speak, but the Marine with the eagle tattoo raised one hand, palm open. "Don't," he said, calm but firm. "Not today." People from the church stood watching. Some recorded, some wept. Others just placed their hands over their hearts, because they understood, too, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about honor, about showing up when it mattered, about letting a man bury his wife without humiliation. The veterans helped Harold back up the steps. One held his arm. Another carried the urn. As they re-entered the church, the silence followed. But this time, it was a silence filled with reverence. For Harold, for Margaret, and for every man who had ever stood alone when he shouldn't have. Inside, the pastor waited. The pews were still. The air was different now. Harold sat again near the front. This time, he wasn't alone. The Marine, soldier, and sailors filled the side aisles, standing in full view, not disrupting, not imposing, just present. The ceremony continued. Margaret's name was spoken gently, her memory honored fully. And beside her urn, Harold sat upright, bruised but proud, with a flag across his lap and a quiet army of brothers standing watch. Outside, the motorcycles waited, not for a fight, but for the finish of a farewell, that should have never been stained. And when it was done, they escorted Harold's truck, not with sirens, not with horns, but with a slow, solemn ride through town. Headlights on, flags flying, and every eye watching as a war veteran brought his bride to rest, with the honor that should have been there all along. The young officer opened his mouth, trying to speak. His voice cracked as he stammered. Something about doing his job, about not knowing, about how he didn't mean to hurt anyone. But the words fell flat. No one replied. No one nodded. No one accepted the explanation. The crowd outside the church stood still. There was no shouting, no fists raised, just quiet. One older veteran stepped forward. He had a silver beard, a limp in his right leg, and a Marine Corps ring on his finger. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in close, just looked the officer straight in the eye and spoke calmly. "You don't put your hands on one of ours," he said. "Not today. Not ever." The young man blinked, stepped back. He looked around at the others, the wall of veterans, the mourners, the townsfolk, and realized there was no defense that would undo what had happened. Not now. Silence settled over the street again. But it wasn't empty. It was thick, weighted, a silence louder than sirens, heavier than apology, the kind of silence that wraps around a moment and preserves it forever. Harold didn't say much. He didn't have to. He stood on the steps, urn in his hands, fingers curled gently around the polished wood. The bruises on his face had started to show, a line above his eyebrow, a swelling near his cheek. But he didn't complain, didn't accuse, didn't ask for anything. He just nodded once, quietly, to the men standing beside him. Then, slowly, he turned and walked into the church. Each step was deliberate. Each breath was measured. The cane tapped gently against the stone walkway. The new one, gifted by a fellow soldier just minutes earlier. The veterans followed, not crowding, not leading, just close enough to say without words, "We've got you." The officer remained outside. He didn't move, didn't speak again, and no one asked him to. Inside the church, the service resumed. Margaret's favorite hymn played softly from the old organ. The stained glass windows cast long beams of color across the pews. The pastor's voice trembled slightly as he welcomed Harold back to the front. The urn was placed gently on the altar, a flag draped nearby, a folded note. Harold's own letter to Margaret rested beside it. The crowd sat quietly, listened, grieved. But for Harold, the noise of the world had faded. What mattered was this: Margaret was home. She was remembered. She was honored. And despite the bruises, the fall, the pain, he had walked her all the way there. No one stopped him. Not this time. Outside, the motorcycles still lined the street. Their riders stood watch. Quiet, present, a wall of respect that didn't need words. That never did. Because in some moments, the most powerful things are not the speeches or the headlines, not the justice or the anger. It's the silence that comes when people stand together, the silence that says, "This mattered," and that we will remember. Later that afternoon, the story traveled faster than anyone expected, not because of the fall, not even because of the officer, but because of the silence. Someone had recorded it. The moment 15 veterans stood shoulder to shoulder around one of their own. No shouting, no threats, just quiet strength. The kind of strength built in foxholes, in cold barracks, in long nights halfway across the world. The kind that says, "We don't forget our own." By evening, the video had made its way to local news, then national. The clip didn't need commentary. It didn't need music or edits. Just the image. One old man, face bruised, holding an urn, and behind him, a wall of men in leather and denim, standing guard. People watched it over and over. Some cried. Some called it shameful. Some called it beautiful. The town's police department issued a public apology. A press conference was held. The young officer was placed on leave, pending investigation. They promised more training, more awareness, more respect. But Harold didn't watch the press conference. He was home by then, sitting quietly on his front porch, a folded flag resting on his lap. He didn't want any of it. Not the attention. Not the headlines. Not the fuss. All he wanted was to bury his wife in peace, to walk her to the altar, to whisper goodbye, to remember the woman who waited through 2 deployments, who raised their children, who sat beside him in the quiet hours of retirement. He never wanted to be the center of a national story. But what he got instead was something else. He got to see it. The power of quiet loyalty. The meaning of brotherhood. He saw how a few men with tired eyes and worn boots could still stand taller than any badge. How strangers could become family, not by blood, but by bond. The cane gifted to him that day rested beside the porch rail. Every now and then, Harold would run his fingers over the brass eagle on top, not for the cane itself, but for the hands that gave it, for what it meant. People drove by that week, some slowing down, some waving. A few left notes on his doorstep. Others dropped off flowers, pie, even new walking shoes. Harold thanked them all, but mostly he sat in silence, because he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about all the Harolds. All the men who had served returned home and tried to live quiet lives, only to find that sometimes, even in peace, they're forced to stand again. And when that moment comes, they are not alone. That's what mattered, not the apology, not the viral post, not even the justice. What mattered was the silence, the kind that says, "We see you, we remember, and we stand with you, always." If you ever worn a uniform or ever loved someone who did, then you understand. The bond between those who served never truly breaks. And when one of U.S. falls, we show up. No speeches, no banners, just quiet respect, brotherhood, an unshakable sense of duty. This story isn't just about Harold. It's about all of us, those who still believe that respect is something sacred, something you never take away. If this story moved you, I invite you to subscribe to the Old Soldier channel. Here, we remember them, we honor them, and we make sure their voices are never forgotten. Leave a comment for Harold. Share this story with someone who still believes in dignity and human kindness. And don't forget to hit like, so stories like this continue to live on in the hearts of those who still care.